Scotland is celebrated worldwide for her natural beauty. Her wild glens and moors. Her deep lochs. Her rugged mountains and magnificent coastline. It's hard to imagine man has made any impact at all. But every square inch has been affected by centuries of human activity. I'm going to look at how man made Scotland's landscape and how this history has shaped the present. This week, back from the brink of extinction, the story of the men who brought Scotland's forests back to life. Today, I'm time travelling on Loch Maree in Wester Ross. I'm going to a place where time has stood still. It's a place that allows us to glimpse how Scotland might have looked thousands of years ago, before man made his presence truly felt. Out here, on a group of islands, stands a rare remnant of the great pine forest that dominated Scotland's landscape and survives practically undisturbed by man, thanks only to its remote location.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Ewan. It's like a fairy tale forest, isn't it? There's just something slightly unreal about it. And then you're looking up straight in to see the top of the canopy. I've been dying to come here for 25 years. 25 years ago in university I heard about this relic of ancient Caledonian forest on an island in this Scottish loch. And this was it.
These islands are left to experience all that nature has in store for them. And here in Wester Ross, more often than not, that means rain. 22 glorious days out of every 30. Which makes it so wet, in fact, that this forest is officially classified as rainforest. The wet climate has a remarkable effect on the ecosystem.
Look at these. These are mosses, believe it or not. Ah, this whole thing is a huge hummock of moss.
Beside the biggest, prickliest bushes.
And that, now that is a juniper. And normally this is quite a small bush, but there's no berries on it, but this is huge.
And underfoot, springy heather. It's tricky to negotiate. And then there are the trees themselves. From one end of the island to the other, you find Scots pine, Scotland's symbolic tree in every part of its life cycle. From young saplings to old dead trees still standing undisturbed among the living. The entire landscape still just as nature created it.
This place has barely felt the hand of man. I mean, these islands contain some of the most ancient and pristine woodlands in the country. The pines here, they grow to maybe 250 years old, but they're part of an uninterrupted genetic line that goes back almost to the Ice Age. This is as close as Scotland gets to the wild.
In the first few thousand years after the Ice Age, Scotland's forests grew vast and covered maybe as much as 60% of the landscape. And it wouldn't only have been Scots pine that grew. The trees included oak, birch, hazel, rowan and alder. And back then it would have been truly wild. Scotland's forests would have shaken with bear, beavers, boars, wolves, wild cows, wild deer, and of course, us. We were part of that natural landscape, ourselves a creation of nature. Hunters and gatherers who depended on the forests for the basics of our survival. So much of that earliest knowledge of the forest has been lost in time. But thankfully, not all. In Glen Nant, in Argyll, I've arranged to meet one of Scotland's leading wilderness instructors.
Hello, how are you doing? Pleased to meet you.
A man called Patrick McGlinchey, who I'm hoping will teach me some of the skills our ancestors would have relied upon when they hunted and gathered here.
So is that a shelter then, is it?
Yeah, this is my camp.
This is your camp.
So come on round and I'll introduce you to it.
That is a work of art. This is luxurious. Look at this. So what's this? Is this for firewood?
No, that's bark. See this stuff here? This is elm, witch elm. Now we can strip that off.
Right.
And we end up with strips like that. Then we take the outer bark off, and then what we can do with lots of natural fibres like barks and nettles.
It's like I'm going into a shop here.
We can make cordage. So this is some of the natural fibres you'll find in the UK.
Amazing.
We have mainly oak and birch here.
Right.
We have some mountain ash, and we have a lot of hazel.
Hazelnuts were a nutritious staple of the hunter-gatherer diet, one that we still eat today. But there are plenty of other natural forest foods that we've forgotten about.
The woodland's full of wonderful material. It's just knowing what you're looking at.
Yeah.
We're going to go over that way because I could see a little hawthorn.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
The hawthorn's leaves at this time of the year are edible.
Right.
You just got to be careful because
You got a wee spike in
it's
it?
not called the hawthorn for nothing.
Yeah. Thorny.
Okay? So don't be shy.
Is there a trick?
Just pinch the tops. Try and not get the twiggy part in. And these are delicious.
See, I don't taste anything yet. Should I taste something, or is it my palate's just not ready, or is it?
You're expecting the pizza or something.
I'm expecting an infusion of taste.
Well,
there.
you will, because we're going to add to this.
Right.
Here's an interesting little plant here, Ian. This is common sorrel. Tell me what that does to your taste buds.
It's a real fizz, isn't it? Just bursts out.
We don't take too much, just enough to fill a hole, as they say.
Scotland's hunter-gatherer population was maybe as low as 10,000. For them, one small patch of forest like this could provide not just food, but tools and vital fuel for the skill that set them apart from the other creatures of the woods.
Right, long strokes. More use of the bow gives you more revolutions. Now, start to build up the speed. You're going to get smoke very shortly. Now, that wee squeak there was the wood spirit laughing at you.
Oh, aye. Okay.
The wood should be warm now.
I can see some smoke coming off, or dust.
Just take that out. You've got a coal there. I can tell by the smoke. Well, I'll hold it for you. There you go.
See, how can you do that? I tell my kids not to play with fire.
No, well, so they shouldn't either. But anyway, well done, that man.
That was fantastic.
Congratulations.
I thought I'd lost it that little bit. I just thought it's not enough.
No,
It's
you
exhausting.
were on the ball. That's really
That's
good.
my first fire. It's funny that that's a salad that's got nothing you'd normally get in. Normally in the sense of what everyday supermarkets would have. but it's packed full of taste.
Yeah.
How did those ancient peoples kind of keep everything in balance though? Stop taking too much?
Well, they moved about the landscape. They didn't always take from one area, and they moved with the seasons. When we gathered these plants up, we only took a handful of leaves from one, handful of leaves from the hawthorn. We didn't destroy it all. That's what it's all about.
You know, what's been so fantastic about this is just that feeling that you're seeing the familiar in a completely unfamiliar way. These are living places. Places that give us sustenance, give us fire. Resources that for our ancestors were absolutely commonplace, and yet today seem exotic and alien. The woods are just the most wonderful place. Might not go home. Wild man of the woods.
Scotland's small, mobile population of hunter-gatherers left little trace. Their footprint in the forest was so light that even after 4 millennia, pristine forests full of wild animals still covered up to 50% of the land. But change was coming to Scotland's landscape on a massive scale. The future for much of our native forests was bleak. Nowhere more so than here on Rannoch Moor, where they disappeared almost entirely. What happened here? Did man turn destructive?
It's amazing what you find in the peat. Over the years, tree stumps like these have given rise to all sorts of fanciful speculations about Scotland's forests and about the role of man in destroying them. Often, invaders have been given the blame. The Romans, the Vikings, and those perennial scapegoats, the English. But it just doesn't add up.
One, two, three.
By digging down into the peat, pollen scientists like Richard Tipping have found evidence of a much less fanciful story. He's discovered that trees thrived here until about 5,000 years ago, when they suddenly stopped thriving.
Oh, that's all right. And then slide it down again, and out. There. And
This is
our
a
core.
messy bit. Okay.
And
I love this moment though.
oh,
The
this
reveal.
This is the first time you see what's down there.
Here it comes.
And that's it. What we have here in this brown gunge is peat. More importantly, what we have here is a record of how this particular site changes through time.
And what are you looking for in there?
Well, we start to pick up colour changes. So here, from around here upwards, we have a dry period on
Right.
the bog, perhaps a dry climate. Down here, it's wetter, much, much wetter.
And does that mean rainfall?
These are when climate appears to change very abruptly.
So what did that mean for the trees here?
What we think happened was that the climate shifted. It became cooler and wetter. Both cool and wet conditions mean that the water table in this peat bog starts to rise. Now these pines are adapted to that. All their roots are shallow.
Right.
But if you get water right to the surface, then there's nothing else they can do except die of oxygen starvation, effectively.
It's great to think of these barren flatlands like here in Rannoch Moor and all the rest in a completely different way, as a kind of big, thick forest.
Populations of pine trees across Scotland, from here in Rannoch Moor, way up to the North mainland of Scotland, all seem to have died at the same time, about 4,000 years ago. People have described this as the collapse of the population. It's the complete failure of the pine ecosystem to cope with rapidly changing climate.
There's quite a lot in a cylinder of black mud, isn't there?
There's a story, yes.
Amazing story.
So around 4,000 years ago, thriving forests all over Scotland drowned suddenly and never came back.
Nature changed Scotland's forests, left behind a trail of devastation that man would never match. It's estimated that around half the trees that were once here just couldn't grow when it got cooler. Man wasn't to blame. Not then. Not yet.
Man really began to impact on the forests just as this period of climate change ended, when we settled down to become farmers. When we started farming in earnest, at least a quarter of Scotland was still covered in thick forest. But farming changed everything. We moved around less. Instead, we stayed put. We grew crops and kept animals. As we created permanent communities, our axes and our animals began to take their toll on the forests. And in the new clearings, we raised monuments to long-forgotten gods, like these in Kilmartin Glen.
We cleared the land as we needed to. As a species, we advanced while the forests, they retreated acre by acre and glen by glen. But they were never quite abandoned. After all, they were our life support system.
There are no written records to tell us what happened to our pristine forests, to our wilderness. What we do know is that the human population boomed. Soared from an estimated 10,000 back in hunter-gatherer times to maybe as much as 500,000 by the start of the Middle Ages. Which meant our life support system had more life to support. So we became experts at forest management, and we celebrated each year when the forests grew abundant again.
This is Beltane, an ancient festival of renewal, which, as you can see, has been recently revived.
If not completely reinvented. Among all this mystical mayhem are two central characters, the May Queen and the Green Man. In this version of Beltane, the Green Man is killed with fire and brought back to life. His death and resurrection tell a story of renewal and of the new life that returns to the fields and to the forests each springtime. In medieval times, the Green Man was a popular figure, and the idea he represented was widely understood. But by then, celebrations like Beltane masked a bigger problem. The most sought-after trees of the forest were in serious decline.
It's fantastic, the noise, the smoke. It's got this kind of mystical, otherworldly feel to it. The thing is, renewal and regeneration, they're pretty practical affairs. I mean, the forests were carefully managed such that the plants and the trees that you needed on a daily basis were nurtured so they came back year after year. What didn't come back, what didn't grow fast, was prestige wood. Big wood, if you like. Wood of a stature that you needed for big ambitions and big structures.
Prestige wood, mainly from oak trees, took hundreds of years to grow back. As we turned farming settlements into proper towns, our consumption of it soared. By 1424, wood was scarce enough that the Scottish Parliament made stealing wood 3 times a capital offence. But scarcity didn't stop bishops wanting bigger cathedrals. or nobles wanting stronger castles, or kings wanting the most extravagant thing of all, warships bigger and better than those of their enemies.
James IV of Scotland was a man that wasn't short of ambition. And in the 16th century, with England and Scotland regularly at each other's throats, that ambition was firmly fixed on military might. He wanted a flagship for a navy that he dreamed of creating. Not just any flagship would do. James wanted to build the biggest ship in the world.
It was so vast that a new dock here at Newhaven in Edinburgh had to be dug to build it in. And as the giant wooden hull took shape, the spectacle was recorded by the poet William Dunbar. Carpenters, builders of barks and balangers, masons lying upon the land, and shipwrights hewing upon the strand.
It must have been an amazing sight. The only problem seems to have been whether there was enough Scottish wood to complete it. The evidence is patchy, but in 1505, the year before they started to build the Great Michael, the Scottish Parliament declared that forests of Scotland were utterly destroyed. And 60 years later, one chronicler lamented that the Great Michael had used up all the wood in Fife. What we do know is that wood had to be brought down from Morayshire, some from Stirlingshire, and some even imported from France and Norway.
Despite the vast amount of wood James invested in his ambition, Scotland was never destined to be a naval power. At least, not for long. Just 2 years after the Great Michael was launched, James IV was killed in battle, and his mighty flagship was sold off cheap to the French. By the start of the 16th century, the great natural forests that had cloaked Scotland when man started farming were no more. Perhaps as little as 10% of Scotland still contained its natural forests. And they were increasingly characterised as the haunts of wolves and the concealments of men. Those wolves were persecuted mercilessly. Burned out of their dens, cubs hunted down each year. Eventually, they had nowhere to hide. The forests were so small that they were eradicated once and for all. And they went the way of beaver, bear and boar, off into the past. And left Scotland's landscape irreversibly changed. What man had taken away, he would now have to try to put back by creating man-made forests. Planting new trees was a simple first step, and nurturing them over several decades, if not generations, was the next. It was a task that was taken up by some of Scotland's biggest landowners who smelled profit in the air. Here at Blair Castle, John, the 4th Duke of Atholl, took up tree planting in the 18th century with such a vengeance that he's known today as Planter John. His tree of preference was something his grandfather had originally introduced and was only now coming to maturity. A coniferous tree called the larch.
That larch over there looks rather tired and ragged, doesn't it? It's partly because it loses its needles in winter, which means that at this time of year it looks bald and its branches are drooping. But it's also because that particular larch was a gift to the Duke of Atholl in 1737, which makes it nearly 280 years old. That tree became the object of Planter John's attention and the focus of his ambition, because under that bark is a kind of miracle wood.
The larch is a rather remarkable tree. Originally from the Alps, it's hardy, not needy. It grows well high up hillsides and on poor soil. And what's more, its wood doesn't rot easily in water. A property which made it the foundation of one very grand design.
Planter John imagined that he might, on the bare Perthshire hills around the castle, plant enough larch trees to satisfy the demands of the entire British Navy. And in doing so, he would make a fortune.
The Duke set about his business with utter zeal, and he kept incredible records. Some might say obsessive.
This beautiful leather-bound book is where the Duke of Atholl used to note all of the records of planting that was going on around the estate. And I just love the comment at the start. It said, "Woods and forests, as they were, as they are, as in all probability they will be." So this was his ambition, if you like, for the future, and records of what was happening. Gosh, the details are unbelievable. Every time he uses the word larch, he puts it in red. The date and then larch, 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 larch. This is a guy who loved the larch. About 450 acres were planted with about 400,000 larch, which comes to £375. And then he's got other things, 60,000 hardwood spruce, it's not in red, not very impressive, I think, that's 60 quid. And 700,000 Scotch fir, which is only £35. But clearly what's coming through there is just how valuable the larch is. This isn't so much someone who's doing some personal accountancy. This is a personal ambition. This is a vision, a strategy, really.
The Duke sent a consignment of 800 larch trees of 60 years' growth to the Admiralty in 1816. They were impressed. So he planted more, and more, and more, until his estates were transformed. By the middle of the 19th century, the planter Dukes of Atholl had put in 21 million trees on the hillsides of Perthshire. The fortune Planter John dreamed of seemed finally to be within reach. But it wasn't to be.
The grand design of making a fortune by selling the wood to the Navy for warships came to nothing, because the Navy went metal.
Ironclad hulls came in, and Planter John's successors were left with rather a lot of trees on their hands.
Planter John once wrote that planting should be for beauty, effect, and for profit. And although it didn't quite have the happy ending he'd hoped for financially, it did succeed on the other two fronts. Thanks to him, this part of Perthshire became famous as a beauty spot.
Albeit an unnatural one, showing wild romantic Scotland clad in the trees of the Central European Alps. The ambitions of estate owners like the Duke of Atholl created a buzz around trees. Inspired by the Enlightenment and by the possibility that man could improve upon the hand of God, the planting of exotic species took off and spawned both fashion and competition.
Good. We need to check all the buckles on your harness. Make sure everything's done up properly.
tree hunters in the pay of wealthy landowners ventured around the globe, looking for trees that might catch on at home. They harvested seeds by gun or by hand, often climbing to the very top for the healthiest cones. And sometimes they made discoveries that changed the face of Scotland. Discoveries like this species, the Douglas fir.
I reckon I must be about 45 feet or 15 metres above the ground, which is about the average height of a Scots pine, but not a Douglas fir. Aye, I've got loads to go. This is going to be a long haul.
I'd set out to climb to the top of this tree, all 35 metres of it. But with the sun going down and progress slow, I had to abandon the climb about 3/4 of the way up. The tree that defeated me, the Douglas fir, is named in honour of the famous Scottish botanist who discovered it. A man called David Douglas, who appears to have been a far more successful tree climber than I'll ever be.
That feels better.
In 1825, David Douglas was sent on a mission by the Horticultural Society to the uncharted Pacific Northwest of America. There he encountered Douglas firs growing undisturbed in virgin forests, ancient giants that utterly captivated him. He harvested some of their seeds and sent them on their long journey to his patrons half a world away in Britain. One of those patrons lived here on Scone Palace Estate.
Douglas dispatched his seeds back any way he could, land or sea. Some made it, some didn't. This one did. He picked it up as a seed somewhere on the Pacific coast of America almost 200 years ago. Over there they grow for 800 years, so that one, it's just a youngster.
Which makes it even more painful that I didn't get to the top. Seeds and seedlings of rare and exotic trees collected on expeditions abroad changed hands for up to 15 guineas, a small fortune back then, and affordable only by those with money to spare and status to show off. Wealthy landowners happy to confirm their own good taste by planting a pinetum or arboretum in a corner of their estate.
Trees like these had never been more fashionable. No magnificent garden could be complete without them, but they weren't merely displays of wealth. They served another purpose, which, with the advent of photographs and mass travel, we've kind of glossed over. And that is it allowed people to see, to feel, to smell other parts of the world. Trees were sources of knowledge, even enlightenment. These are fantastic. Go and look at this. This is the giant sequoia. Look at the texture of the bark. But what's great is it's soft and cushiony. Look. That's not because I'm dead macho. That's because this is just really soft. I think you could eat some of these. Never entirely sure. No, not that one. And this is a cypress, one of the cedar family. It's got gorgeous leaves, just smell really rich. They're fantastic. That tree there is the same as this one. It's a Sitka spruce. I mean, look at it. It's fantastic. It's like just a big umbrella of branches.
The west coast of America, the shores of Chile, Japan, China, morsels of the world and a flavour of its wonders were planted, grown and marvelled at across Scotland.
In the pursuit of beauty and knowledge, the planters and gardeners of the 19th century created gorgeous spaces and enchanting groves, all designed to delight the eye. These were remarkable individual indulgences, living works of art, and they completely changed the face of the nation's gardens and estates forever. But the thing that this passion for planting didn't do was to reforest the bare hillsides of Scotland.
There were still pockets of healthy old forests, oak in the west and pine in the north, and new forests of larch in Perthshire. But it wasn't enough. By 1870, only 4% of the land was wooded. So 96% of Scotland was barren. Quite simply, we were consuming much more wood than we were growing back. Our appetite sated only by imports from the Baltic and from the vast virgin forests of the British Empire. Some voices called for the state to step in and manage the forests, like it did in other countries, but their warnings fell on deaf ears, and a time bomb slowly started ticking. The time bomb finally went off in 1917, when Britain was 3 years into a war that demanded total mobilisation. Wood was vital to the war effort. But as German U-boats blockaded Britain, the imports of timber that we'd come to rely on couldn't get through. As the blockade turned into a crisis, the short-sightedness of a previous generation came home to roost. We just hadn't planted enough trees. We almost lost that war, not like Germany from a lack of food, but remarkably from a lack of wood. The crisis highlighted an ongoing national weakness, one that demanded immediate government action. It was time for the state to step in. Which is how, on November 29th, 1919, two lords happened to be racing each other by train from London. One lord was heading to Devon, and the other, Lord Simon Fraser Lovett, was heading for the north of Scotland. It was a sporting challenge, undertaken from the comfort of a first-class carriage, but it had a very serious purpose.
Before the war, Lord Lovett was something of a voice in the wilderness, calling for state forestry, but to be honest, no one paid him much attention. When the war started, he made himself useful as a man in charge of supplying wood to frontline troops. So it was only natural that in peacetime, he was given responsibility for Britain's new forestry organisation, the Forestry Commission.
The race from London was to see who could plant its first tree.
When he got off the train in Morayshire, he was handed a telegram which told him that he'd lost the race. The first tree of the Forestry Commission had been planted in Devon by his deputy. Undeterred, Lovett went on to plant the second tree instead. This was a man on a mission. Trees will grow where no trees should or would, he vowed.
His organisation would grow a whole new supply of wood, plant enough trees to keep Britain going for 5 whole years, longer surely than even the worst future blockade would last. Lovett's first problem was that trees, and good land to grow them on, cost money. And the post-war British government was broke. And it soon became apparent that Lovett's new foresters would have their work cut out for them. Because the type of land the new Forestry Commission could afford to buy was some of the most exposed, rocky, and altogether unpromising farmland in the entire country. So the Forestry Commission set up experimental forest sites like this one at Kilmun in Argyll to determine which trees would thrive and how. Here, they planted in lines, they planted in squares, they planted close together and far apart. They planted high up in the hillside and low down the hill. And they planted trees from all over the world.
What they discovered was that species from the Pacific Northwest had done particularly well.
Right.
Species like Douglas fir, like the giant redwood, the Wellingtonia, western hemlock, and so on. But the one that very early on performed best was Sitka spruce.
Sitka spruce, whose seeds had also been sent back by David Douglas almost a century earlier.
So in this X factor for trees, spruce comes through. Why was spruce so good?
Its indigenous conditions are very similar to the west of Scotland. It's used to wet, it has its feet in the wet virtually all the time. It has coastal fog coming in, dripping on coastal precipitation.
Mountain slopes, presumably?
Absolutely, steep slopes. So it's very well suited to the British Isles, Western Europe, the coast in particular.
This tree thrived in places where others faltered. In wet peaty soil and at unpromising altitudes, it simply outcompeted all other species. It grew tall, it grew straight, and it grew very, very fast. And experiments at places like Kilmun showed that it thrived even when planted merely 1.5 metres apart, which meant it could be positively crammed into any site. Spruce's moment didn't come immediately. It took 20 years or so for spruce to become the Commission's favourite tree, and by then, the world had changed. The Forestry Commission of the 1950s didn't seem to have noticed that its original 5-year mission had been overtaken by events, that sea blockades were a thing of the past, and that no amount of wood would help win a war against the A-bomb. They carried on planting like it was 1919. At first platoons, then companies of them, and regiments. Slowly but surely, whole armies. Wooden soldiers waiting to be called into action in the event of a future war that never came. By sticking to its mission, the Forestry Commission created one of the most amazing and dramatic landscape transformations Scotland had ever known. But creating tomorrow's timber was not without its consequences.
Right across Scotland, renewal was taking place, but the securing of the timber supply resulted in something completely unexpected. Frankenstein forests.
Human-made, and all the more unnatural for it. Square, dark, dingy, ugly, silent, unappealing, unattractive, lacking in wildlife.
I hate these places. Apart from being poked in the eye every few minutes. They're just so dark and dingy. There's that lack of sunlight, as well as the fact that on the ground here, it's just a carpet of needles. That makes the soil acidic, which means that it's just impossible for a lot of the natural life to erupt out of the forest floor. I'm glad to be out of there. These places, these plantations, weren't like forests as we'd known them before in ancient times. Instead, they were crops, trees that were invasive in form and had one function and one function only: to be chopped down. The Forestry Commission were largely unconcerned about these unnatural new forests. Timber production came first, and Sitka was its wonderwood. But not everyone agreed with the new orthodoxy, that forests should be only for supplying timber. Professor Hugh Stephen and Dr. Jock Carlyle from Aberdeen University were gentle dissenters, rebels in tweeds and brogues, and very sharp ecologists. To them, the value of the forests went beyond the mere timber they contained. They realised that Scotland's forests had arrived at a crucial moment. One where any remnants of old native pine woods, the sort of woods that once covered great swathes of Scotland, might soon be completely swamped by the new, unnatural Sitka spruce plantations, and that unique habitats and ecosystems could be on the verge of vanishing forever. So they set out on a research mission to discover exactly what was left of Scotland's ancient pine woods. Tucked away in the Central Highlands, they came across the spectacular Scots pine forest of Glen Affric. Although it wasn't exactly untouched by human hands, Glen Affric had survived with very little interference. With a team of foresters, Jock Carlyle spent a few summers collecting samples here and in Scotland's other isolated pockets of pine. They shot down cones with a shotgun. They harvested lichens and mosses, and bit by bit, they created a picture of Scotland's native pine woods. It was magical. The book they wrote captures in vivid detail the sort of rich, natural habitats that existed in the pine forest that had once covered Scotland's landscape. In some ways, it was a manifesto against progress. To stand in them is to feel the past, they wrote in the book's introduction. And the idea of feeling the past influenced a whole new generation to resist the rampant spread of soulless spruce forests. Foresters like the young Finlay MacRae, a follower of Stephen and Carlyle, and another gentle rebel.
Well, you know, I'd heard a lot about Glen Affric. And it was a place I envied anybody that worked here.
Right.
And I always felt that this was the sort of jewel in the crown of the Forestry Commission. If there was a place where you would be asked, where do you want to work? I would have always said, Well, Glenafric appeals to me because of the nature of the place.
What was it about it then that appealed?
Natural forest, you know. It was put here by a greater hand than ours, you know. And that appealed to me because there it is. It's, for all the world, I thought it was sprinkled from some great duster and landed here and grew. And that's interesting. Let's put it this way. I would dodge off to Glenafric at times.
Was this your hiding place then?
Very often.
Finlay was eventually put in charge of his hiding place by the Forestry Commission.
So what was the policy of the Forestry Commission at that time then?
Well, the policy was changing all the time. When I came into forestry, which is a long time ago now, there was a very big swing to spruce.
Right.
And spruce is something which has taken over.
You're not a fan of spruce?
I'm not a fan of spruce, and I don't like these square blocks on some of our hillsides.
Yeah.
You know, they don't appeal to me at all. You know, and they're fenced off square and they're planted square, and a lot of the folk that are planting them are square themselves.
Finlay McRae discovered that the Forestry Commission had already planted young spruce trees among the ancient pines. So when Finlay took over Glenafric, he quietly removed them, sacrificed tomorrow's timber for the sake of conservation. Though he didn't always spell out to his bosses what he was up to.
It's almost like you're off the radar up here. You seem to be adopting on the quiet, a slightly different policy.
I suppose I might have been a crank. It's a great word.
Did they give you trouble?
What?
Did they give you trouble?
Some
did the boss
of them,
people come
some
up and...
people did. And some people saw me as extremely old-fashioned.
Old-fashioned?
Yes,
That's quite interesting.
which I am, or was then, but now I'm not so old-fashioned now because everybody's creeping back this way, aren't they?
Yeah.
When Finlay McRae left Glenafric in 1985, its future as a native pinewood was largely secure. The Forestry Commission was slowly changing its policies, and people in its ranks who favoured conservation were no longer considered cranks and rebels. Its mission was still to provide crops of timber, but gradually it also became a protector and promoter of our woodlands, bringing the public back into the forests. Today, woodland conservation is not only ingrained in the Forestry Commission's DNA, but has developed a life of its own. And sometimes the trees themselves are no longer the star attraction.
Good morning everybody and welcome to the Lochgarten Osprey Centre. Just to give you a quick introduction to the bird you can see in the nest here, this is E.J. This is a resident female here at Lochgarten. She's been nesting here for 7 years now, and during that time she's raised 11 chicks successfully, so she's had a fantastic time over here.
In 1954, ospreys returned to the Abernethy Forest on Speyside. As soon as the news got out, bird lovers flocked to see them. Around 14,000 people came in the very first year. Soon, the Lochgarten ospreys had become fixed in the public's affection like some wonder of the natural world. But popularity brought its own problems. The bird's nesting habitat was inadvertently disturbed, and the eggs were regularly stolen. Gradually, the RSPB realised that the birds needed protection from us. So in 1988, it bought the forest to hold as a bird sanctuary forever. And since then, it has become one of the most important protected habitats in Britain.
This forest, though, as well as being a breeding ground for ospreys, is also breeding ground for capercaillie and lots of other species. I mean, something like 3,000 animal, insect and plant rare species are found here. Which means that this forest has a slightly different function to many others. The function of this forest is simply not to change.
The RSPB has a 250-year vision for the Abernethy Forest, and their intention is it will look then just as it does now. For the moment, Scotland's foresters have found a balance between conservation and planting, conserving the old, creating the new. Around 17% of the country is now covered in trees. But the transformation is still not complete. The target is to restore around a quarter of Scotland's landscape to forest, as much as there was when man first started farming. We still have a way to go, but it's a restoration that anyone can be part of. On the 1st of January in the year 2000, a group of volunteers got together and planted these. The first trees of a vast restoration project to recreate the woodland that once covered this Borders hillside. Since then, the Carafran Wildwood project has planted 500,000 more trees. Trees of the species that would once have grown here before they were cleared.
It's been a long time disappearing.
Yeah.
We're putting it back rather suddenly.
Yeah.
And it won't look natural for a good many years.
And they've done it entirely voluntarily, funded with hard-won grants and donations.
I would hope to be able to come back in 20 years.
Yeah.
When the trees are going to be pretty well
This
established.
side, pretty much across.
Yeah. And you'll be able to get an impression of how the valley, be able to see whether it has really worked.
Got to stay here. For me, the enjoyment is the fact that you come out on the Tuesday and you meet other guys and we get a bit of fresh air.
Could be golfing, but it's trees.
No, it wouldn't be golfing for me. But
I'm with you with that one, I think. Right, so I should pack this in a bit more, shouldn't I?
What's happening here at Carafran takes imagination and a bit of faith. They're planting for the future, but they're not planting for tomorrow. It's going to be mature forest here in something like 100 years or so, which means that the people that are working on this won't live to see it in its glory. In fact, neither will I. Neither will you. And there's the rub. In our busy world with packed lives and short attention spans, it takes visionaries to stand back and imagine a landscape that only their children and grandchildren will see. I guess we just need a few more visionaries.
Off to Jimmy's Food Factory here on BBC HD this evening at 1, after another chance to see Mark Lawson interview Tom Jones in just a few moments.